Another idea in the 1970s that was there that came about in order to help us with these issues of lingering racism was affirmative action. And the idea here is that we know, when we've been studying all of this, that some people have a worse off starting position in real life. And we did an activity on this in class when we were throwing paper balls. When everyone gets a paper ball, you have to put it into the basket, but not everyone gets the same starting spot. And we know that, and we agree that, as we've studied this, that people who are born in certain races, in certain places, with certain class backgrounds, have different chances at success, as unfair as that is. Well, affirmative action is designed to kind of offset that a little bit. It's an active effort to improve the lives of people, the employment of people, the educational opportunities of people, particularly minorities and women. And at first it was this issue of recruiting African Americans for jobs to try and give them a stronger economic foundation to help lift them in their own neighborhoods up out of poverty. This does lead to improved social and economic status for some African Americans, and it is expanded then to include things for women, Latinos, Asians, other ethnic minority groups. But there are people who dislike this idea. Whites are among them, of course. In part, this idea of a quota saying, if I have two candidates for a job, and one of them is better than the other, and it's a white candidate, are you telling me I can't hire that white guy even though he's better than the black guy at the job? Why is that? Carry this over into admissions. Supreme Court has been hearing arguments recently about colleges and universities that want to have a diverse student body to give people a diverse experience so that people can understand the backgrounds of others before they become an adult. Well, to do that, you have to have a diverse student body. So some colleges and universities will use some preferential treatment for women and minorities to make sure their campus is diverse. And so people don't like this. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court does say that schools cannot use fixed quotas. You can't say you have to have so many women, so many black kids, so many Italian kids, so many Hispanic kids, so many Chinese kids. You can't do that, but if you want to have a preference for a certain person, then you can do that. There's a reason for that. And so we're going to see that kind of that anger and that frustration kind of overflow at different times. And here's an interesting argument that I think is worth it. Even if you disagree with affirmative action, what's your plan to guarantee a level playing field? If we know that the playing field is not level to start, and we know it isn't, then what do we do? How do we handle it? And that question of how do we handle an uneven playing field is not just limited to the issues of affirmative action and busing. It also takes place in dealing with some other groups of people that we've talked about before too, like Native Americans, who we know by the 1970s are amongst the poorest ethnic groups in our nation. And this slide shows you that finally in the late 1960s, early 1970s, a number of movements are begun so that Native Americans can finally regain some of what they had lost. Remember, we had talked about in the 1950s a policy put into place by Eisenhower called the termination policy, where it removed Native Americans from their own homelands and forced them to live in cities and give up their culture. And we know that their life as a result, as you can see right here, was absolutely terrible. And Americans begin to listen to this. The Civil Rights Act for Indians was passed in 1968. It actually gives finally legal protection to Native Americans on their reservations and recognizes their tribal courts. But change comes too slowly for some of these people. And even as change comes too slowly, we'll see other people begin to push for, in this case, armed resistance. This is at a small little area in the Ogallala Sioux Indian Reservation called Wounded Knee. And here what you see is a group called the American Indian Movement, and that's going to be your word to put down on your slip of paper for tomorrow, the American Indian Movement. And they occupy this little tiny town on the Sioux Reservation in South Dakota called Wounded Knee and they hold it for 71 days. It's an armed standoff, and their U.S. Marshals and the FBI are firing at the Native Americans. The Native Americans are fighting back, and it's in protest to the unfair treatment and the inability of America's government to honor tribal treaties that have been made across the country with different Native Americans. This kind of protest group, the American Indian Movement, uses this protest, uses violence to gain their rights, and they're successful. They are successful. This victory is built on until 1987. The pressure is maintained until the Supreme Court finally says again Native Americans can have more economic control over their own territories, not just governmental control, and that states can't get in the way. And this is going to be the beginning of a chance for Native Americans to begin to build their own infrastructure economically on their reservations, which is going to be a huge change. So there's another example, if you will, of how society will change, not just for African Americans, but for Native Americans who begin to see their situation improve.